Nothing says welcome back quite like a king tide slamming the door in your face. In Chapter 3, Edge of Ebb and Empire, a return to Savannah after 20 years gets rerouted by rising water, falling memories, and a remora with better suction than your average nostalgia trip. From a colonial outpost draped in resurrection fern to a seafood factory turned museum with a Supreme Court connection, this one follows the current wherever it decides to go. The drive into Wormsloe on the Isle of Hope passes through a leafy tunnel engineered by someone who had just discovered the sublime. 20 years ago, however, I viewed this corridor not as a traveller, but as an unenthusiastic functionary on a grand quest to tally traffic for the University of Georgia. My mission required a clipboard, a mechanical clicker, and the heroic documentation of every station wagon that rolled past toward the historic site. I remember the 1.5-mile lane of live oaks, their limbs heavy with Spanish moss, feeling like a ridiculously grand overture for an opera of professional boredom. Returning 2 decades later, the Canopy appeared indifferent to the indignities of a traffic survey. The site at the end of the lane has proved equally resistant to change, remaining in the hands of descendants of Noble Jones, a carpenter who arrived with James Oglethorpe on the Anne in 1733. Jones secured a lease for 500 acres overlooking the Skidaway Narrows, naming the tract Wormsloe after his family's home in England. While the location currently suggests a gentleman's retreat, Jones selected the peninsula for angles of fire rather than agriculture, adhering to the colony's original mandate as a defensive buffer. Between 1739 and 1745, Jones constructed his home as a fortified outpost to check Spanish ambitions drifting north from Florida. It functioned less as a plantation and more as a military blockhouse that happened to possess a vegetable patch. The design validated itself during the War of Jenkins's Ear, a conflict proving that imperial clashes can indeed start like a bad bar fight. In 1742, scouts operating from Jones's garrison provided the intelligence required to repel a Spanish invasion force, securing the colony's southern approaches. When not coordinating militia scouts, Jones experimented with the trustees' planned agricultural portfolio. He planted corn, rice, and the mulberry trees intended to anchor Georgia's famously doomed silk industry. This colonial startup yielded about as much fine fabric as a rock garden yields soufflé. The initial labor force consisted of indentured servants, a constraint imposed by the colony's founding charter, which, for a time, prohibited slavery. Oak sentinels, weaving history's Spanish moss strands. The native timber has proven far more resilient than the trustees' mulberry trees ever were. The southern live oaks here don't so much grow as they sprawl, resembling magnificent old men taking a permanent nap. They rise 60 feet high, but spread twice as wide, their branches shooting out horizontally with no apparent interest in the sky. The rough bark provides prime real estate for botanical freeloaders, creating a heavy, shadowed canopy that feels ancient. Historically, this wood was prized for a density bordering on the absurd. Before modern composites, the preferred material for checking cannon fire was live oak. The USS Constitution earned its Old Ironsides moniker thanks to hulls reinforced with timber harvested from nearby Daufuskie Island. Standing beneath the Wormsloe Arch, it is easy to feel a reverence for these colonial-era survivors, a connection to the raw materials of empire. That reverence lasts exactly as long as it takes to remember that the entire 1.5-mile avenue is a magnificent lie. This is not a remnant of Jones's 1730s defensive buffer. It is a late Victorian embellishment planted around 1890 by a descendant with a flair for romanticizing the past. It is historical cosplay on a massive scale, the 19th century's specific idea of what the 18th century should have looked like. Clinging to these arboreal imposters is the South's most iconic accessory, Spanish moss. It drapes from the branches in ghostly silver curtains, lending the site its requisite Gothic atmosphere. Here, too, is a deception. It is not Spanish, and it certainly isn't a moss. It is a bromeliad, a relative of the pineapple that has committed a botanical betrayal of the highest order. As an epiphyte, it uses the tree for support but feeds on a dignified diet of air, dust and rainwater, housing spiders and bats without ever draining the host. Sharing the bark is the resurrection fern, a master of theatrical misdirection. In dry weather, this small plant performs a dramatic death scene, shriveling into a crispy brown husk that looks utterly finished. But the moment a rainstorm or a wave of thick Georgia humidity arrives, the act ends. The fern rehydrates and unfurls into a vibrant green, sometimes in less than a day, a constant cycle of death and rebirth played out on a stage of oak. Even the name Spanish moss is the product of a petty, blossoming feud. French colonists, looking to insult their neighbors, compared the grey strands to the tangled beards of Spanish conquistadors, dubbing it barbe espagnole. The Spaniards retorted with cabello francés, French hair, implying the tangled mess resembled a French wig. The English, ever the diplomats, settled on the milder Spanish moss, successfully preserving the inaccuracy. It is a tidy colonial story that travels faster than the complicated truth. The local Choctaw people had already named it tree hair, a label that required neither European rivalry nor botanical confusion. Plink and palmettos, Wormsloe's avenue to archives. So what is the first thing a modern pilgrim does upon reaching a fortified 18th century outpost? He looks for the shuttle bus. Communing with the rugged spirit of Noble Jones required a degree of physical fortitude I was unwilling to summon. My grand expedition would begin by saving my legs a 30-minute walk, a decision Jones, who literally carved this plantation from the maritime forest, would have surely found pathetic. The transport, a glorified farm cart towed by a tractor, undertook its solemn patrol every half hour. It deposited us at a trailhead for a brief loop winding toward the river, past a small replica cabin and through a forest floor dense with saw palmettos that fanned out like the abandoned handbills of a forgotten festival. The walk was visually serene but audibly confused. A persistent, tinny plink, plink, plink echoed through the woods from a nearby police shooting range, as if a small, very patient Revolutionary War platoon was still working on its marksmanship 2.5 centuries later. Walking this ground clarifies the odd duality of the site. After remaining in the Jones family for over 200 years, the estate began to buckle under the modern pressures of debt and taxes. In 1973, the family sold the bulk of the property, some 822 acres of marsh and forest, including the path I was on, to the state of Georgia. The descendants, however, retained the main house and the family cemetery. This resulted in a fantastically strange legal arrangement. The family must use the house as their primary residence, or the land reverts to the state. It is a form of ancestral house arrest, a commitment to heritage with the highest possible stakes. As we exited the trail, I spotted a "Beware of Alligators" sign posted near the marsh. My pulse quickened with the foolish optimism of a tourist hoping for colonial-era peril. I flagged down a park ranger and asked about the likelihood of a skirmish. He offered a look of profound pity. "It would be exceptionally unlikely," he said. "The water here is too salty. They had seen perhaps 2 in the last decade." It was a useful reminder that not every sign delivers on its promise. The sharp-toothed danger of the frontier had faded, much like the colony's military urgency. The struggle for survival had long ago drifted upriver, replaced by a different kind of aggression, the relentless commerce of the port. Steam, salt, and stone, Savannah's commerce built on enslavement. With my grand expedition for a toothy colonial-era demise at Wormsloe having been rudely thwarted by basic water salinity, I decamped from its alligator-deficient marshes. The quiet of the palmettos gave way to the dense, low-gear traffic of downtown Savannah, a city built less on serene contemplation than on a centuries-old world-spanning hustle. Here the past wasn't tucked behind a park gate. It was the ground under my feet, a story told in brick, iron, and stone. To grasp the mechanics of Savannah's ascent, you have to go down to the river. The bluff separating the city from the water is stitched together by Factor's Walk, a curious network of iron-railed ramps and shadowy brick passages. These were the arteries of antebellum commerce, connecting the stately level of Bay Street to the working wharves below. In the 19th century, this was the domain of cotton brokers, known simply as factors, who scurried between warehouses and ships like human stock market algorithms, perspiring in waistcoats and moving mountains of product with a firm handshake. The entire riverfront effectively operated as a machine designed to transfer cargo from a mule-drawn cart to a Europe-bound ship with minimal friction. The lubricant for this machine was cotton. After Eli Whitney's gin supercharged inland production in 1793, Savannah became the funnel through which the white gold of the South poured into British textile mills. By 1820, exports had soared past $14 million. Yet the port wasn't strictly a monotone operation. It also shipped immense quantities of naval stores, tar, pitch, and turpentine bled from the region's pine forests. This resin was the essential chemistry that kept the world's wooden fleets from rotting into driftwood. This immense wealth was, of course, extracted directly from human bondage. Oglethorpe's utopian prohibition on slavery had been overturned in 1751, and the result was a city where high culture and brutal economics occupied the same city blocks. It is a sharp geographical rebuke to stand near the old cotton exchange and realize that the First African Baptist Church rises only a short walk away. Formally recognized in 1788, the church became one of the country's oldest black Baptist congregations, a durable institution of faith constructed in the literal shadow of the market that monetized its members. The city's competitive streak extended to experimental technology. In an attempt to outmaneuver rivals like Charleston, local merchants backed a vessel that must have looked like pure sorcery in 1819, the SS Savannah. Equipped with both sails and a steam engine, it became the first ship to cross the Atlantic using steam power. It was an engineering triumph and a catastrophic business failure. The steam engine consumed so much cargo space that the ship was commercially awkward, the nautical equivalent of inventing a self-driving car with no room for passengers. It was soon converted back to a simple sailing vessel before wrecking a few years later. Far more successful was the investment in iron roads. The Central Railroad and Banking Company, chartered in 1833, forged a link between the port and the cotton fields of Macon. The line's antebellum roundhouse complex remains a masterpiece of industrial masonry. Its 1853 export warehouse has been repurposed as the SCAD Museum of Art, where priceless paintings now hang in a structure designed to hold priceless bales. Even the pavement here narrates a global story. The uneven stones of River Street are granite Belgian blocks, originally brought over as ballast in the holds of empty ships arriving from Europe. Once a vessel was loaded with heavy cotton, the stones were jettisoned on the wharf, where pragmatic city planners used them to pave the streets. Walking here is a tactile engagement with the ghosts of transatlantic voyages. From Bahamian brain coral found in cellar foundations to the Turks and Caicos salt once imported to cure meat, Savannah literally absorbed the world, one discarded stone at a time, turning foreign deadweight into its own cobblestone orphans. Regency on the river, cotton, churches, chains, continuity. The staggering wealth sluicing through the wharves demanded an outlet. You might assume such a sudden gusher of cash would result in a chaotic free-for-all, with mansions popping up like mushrooms in a damp cellar. But Savannah, ever the prim southern belle, had a plan. Or rather, it had the plan. While other boom towns sprawled, this city simply kept unrolling Oglethorpe's grid well into the 1850s, laying out new wards and squares like Pulaski, Madison and Monterey, with the precision of a military parade. It was a conversion of raw capital into civic neatness, largely financed by the cotton and naval stores moving just a few blocks away. To dress this expanding grid, the city embraced the English Regency aesthetic with the enthusiasm of a new convert. Leading the charge was William Jay, an architect who arrived from London around age 25, presumably to show the colonials how a proper portico was done. Jay's work remains a masterclass in elegant restraint. He designed the Telfair family mansion around 1819, a townhouse so chic it eventually became the South's first public art museum. Then there's the Owens Thomas House, another Jay creation considered one of the finest examples of Regency style in America, complete with an indoor plumbing system that was nothing short of futuristic for the era. He also designed the Scarborough House, which was finished just in time to host a gala for the SS Savannah. While the steamship itself turned out to be a commercial dud, the house stood as a durable monument to the stylish, if sometimes impractical, ambition of the merchant class. The money didn't just build walls, it funded a specific social order. Mary Telfair, inhabiting that grand Regency world, eventually left her fortune to found the museum and Georgia's first hospital for women. A few streets over, the Juliet Gordon Low birthplace interprets the domestic sphere of high society powered by enslaved labor, where the founder of the Girl Scouts would later be born. And for those seeking leisure, the Savannah Golf Club claims a 1794 origin, which would make it America's oldest. This assertion is a bit cheeky, given that club initially meant a few gentlemen agreeing golf was an interesting concept, not an actual course, which wouldn't appear for another century. This era of aggressive refinement extended to the spirit as well. The Independent Presbyterian Church, founded by Scottish dissenters decades earlier, erected a magnificent new sanctuary in 1819. But just as the city hit this architectural stride, the ground shifted. In January 1820, the Great Fire consumed 463 buildings, turning the organized grid into a charred skeleton. As if a citywide inferno wasn't enough drama for 1 year. A yellow fever epidemic swept through that summer. The double catastrophe forced a frantic period of physical and moral rebuilding, proving that while a grid can organize a city, it cannot immune it from disaster. Reformation romance, Savannah's spiritual foundations. Walking through a city defined by the elegant Regency townhouses and brick stores of its 19th century commercial peak, one eventually begins to wonder about the spiritual software installed at its conception. It appears that 2 ancient prophecies regarding British religious innovation were fulfilled here simultaneously. One foretelling that Reformation would spring from profound theological debate, the other that it would be sparked by a nobleman's messy breakup. It is a strange historical rhyme that the second prophecy is the one that keeps hitting the mark. If I had a nickel for every time a Brit's romantic implosion created a new Christian denomination, I'd have 2 nickels. It isn't a lot, but it's weird that it happened twice. First, Henry VIII's invention of the Church of England efficiently swapped the Pope for the crown to facilitate a wife swap. 2 centuries later, a young John Wesley's courtship of Sophia Hopkey in Savannah went spectacularly wrong, catalyzing the start of Methodism. In the British tradition, the path to righteousness is often littered with discarded love letters. While liturgical history can be dry, dissecting the creed that served as the colony's official spiritual backbone is essential to understanding the place. This Church of England, or Anglicanism, presented itself as the middle way. It sounds less like a theological stance and more like a parental compromise to stop two children from fighting in the back of a carriage, but it was a genuine attempt to stitch together a new identity. The plan retained grand Catholic traditions, bishops, sacraments, and the historic liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer, while adopting Protestant reforms like the use of English rather than Latin. It was a church designed for maximum inoffensiveness, a sort of theological bige. This carefully balanced faith wasn't just a quirk of the motherland, it was a key colonial export, arriving in the Georgia trustees' luggage right alongside their copy of the Royal Charter. When James Oglethorpe laid out Savannah's famously orderly grid in 1733, the very first public lot set aside was for a Church of England parish. This wasn't merely about saving souls, it was about signalling allegiance. In an empire where public office eventually required Anglican membership, planting a church was akin to planting a flag. It announced to the world, and specifically to the Catholic Spanish in Florida, that this was a well-ordered British space. Yet, the execution was rougher than the ideal. Before the building for Christ Church, soon to be known as the Mother Church of Georgia, was erected, services took place in the courthouse. This practical arrangement meant the same wooden benches witnessed a sermon on Sunday and a sentencing on Monday, turning the room into a provisional clearinghouse for judgment, both temporal and eternal. The entire operation was overseen from afar by clergy dispatched by the London-based Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. Answering to the Bishop of London, Savannah's spiritual life felt like a remote franchise office with headquarters an ocean away. While the Book of Common Prayer dictated worship in English, the reality of the colony required a nod to its diverse population, with services occasionally held in German or French. It was a strange mix. A church born from a king's domestic drama, refined by committee into a moderate middle way, and deployed as a tool of imperial order on the humid Georgia coast. Savannah's spark, the methodical making of a mission. I'd wager that without Savannah, the Methodists wouldn't exist. The American Revolution eventually gave the movement the final shove it needed to formally split from the Church of England, but the seed was planted here. History is littered with religious leaders whose specific brands of ideology died on the vine. For a movement to catch on, it needs fertile soil. Wesley's rigorous, systematic idealism found it, or perhaps forced it, on the 18th century colonial frontier. The story begins well before the Atlantic crossing, with John Wesley himself. Born in 1703 in Epworth, a name that sounds like a town in a fantasy novel that gets sacked in the first chapter, he nearly met that exact fate. In 1709, the family rectory caught fire and young John was rescued from an upper window moments before the roof collapsed. His mother, Susanna, a woman who clearly knew how to frame a narrative, forever after referred to him as a brand plucked from the burning. It is the sort of harrowing origin story that either leads to a life of heroic virtue or a debilitating fear of campfires. Wesley chose virtue. By 1720, he was at Christ Church, Oxford, an institution where one's commitment to higher learning was matched only by one's commitment to avoiding the plague. He collected degrees like trading cards, a B.A. in 1724, ordination as a deacon in 1725, and a fellowship at Lincoln College in 1726. To complete the set, he was ordained a full priest in 1728. During this time, he wasn't just studying, he was meticulously engineering his own soul. His days became a fortress of prayer, fasting, and self-examination, influenced by grimly titled books suggesting happiness was a theological error. Upon his return to Oxford in late 1729, John found his brother Charles had gathered a few like-minded friends. John, being John, immediately organized them. This was the birth of the Holy Club, a name that sounds less like a student society and more like a catering service for saints. Their routine was so rigorously structured it would make a Swiss watchmaker anxious. They took communion frequently, fasted on Wednesdays and Fridays, read scripture and the classics with alarming focus, and, for a bit of light entertainment, visited prisoners and the poor. You might think a group dedicated to piety and charity would be, at worst, politely ignored. But the Holy Club didn't just practice their faith, they weaponized punctuality. Their methodical devotion was so absolute it served as a constant walking rebuke to their more relaxed, ale-inclined classmates. In a moment of collegiate wit, these detractors mockingly labeled them Methodists for their fanatical adherence to routine. It was the 18th century equivalent of a jock calling someone a nerd, only for that nerd to patent the insult and build an international movement around it. This Oxford workshop became the trial run for the entire enterprise. The searching self-audit questions drafted for daily use. Hereby you may every evening review your whole behavior, and the designated pennies for charity were the gears and levers of a system ready for global deployment. With John providing the steady hand and weekly structure, the club produced not just his brother Charles but also the formidable preacher George Whitefield. They were building a spiritual machine, piece by disciplined piece. By 1734, the intellectual blueprint was complete, and the methodical minds of Oxford turned their gaze westward. That same year, a group of German-speaking Protestants known as the Sulzburgers had already landed in Georgia, establishing a town called Ebenezer and setting a precedent for organized piety on the margins of the empire. The stage was set for a clash between rigorous, systematic faith and the chaotic reality of a new world. Georgia Bound, a strict Saints Atlantic odyssey. The intellectual blueprint drafted in the Oxford dormitories met its field test in October 1735 when John Wesley boarded the Simmons off Gravesend. He sailed at the request of James Oglethorpe, bringing his brother Charles and a surplus of missionary zeal to a colony that functioned less as a parish and more as a militarized buffer zone. If the Holy Club was the theory, Georgia was the stress test, and the flaws in the system appeared before the ship even reached the Savannah River. Mid-Atlantic storms battered the Simmons, snapping masts and flooding below decks, while the English passengers, Wesley included, panicked. A group of Moravian settlers sang psalms with unnerving calm. Their tranquility in the face of a violent death rattled Wesley, suggesting his meticulously engineered faith lacked a necessary stabilization mechanism for genuine crises. He arrived in Savannah in February 1736, not as a conquering spiritual general, but as a man quietly unnerved by his own fear. He engaged his duties at Christ Church with the ferocious precision of a forensic accountant. Wesley insisted on the full rubrics of the Book of Common Prayer, demanding baptism by trine immersion, dipping infants 3 times, a practice that likely startled parents accustomed to a gentle sprinkle, particularly given the opaque, silt-heavy nature of local river water. This rigidity grated on a population preoccupied with clearing pine forests, navigating land disputes, and avoiding Spanish patrols. Wesley had arrived dreaming of converting the indigenous population to Christianity. Instead, he found himself managing a surly, survivalist congregation that had little patience for high liturgical scolding. While his public ministry generated friction, his private hours tangled him in the colony's tight social web. He began tutoring Sophia Hopkey, the 18-year-old niece of the chief magistrate, in French. The lessons blurred the line between pastoral care and courtship, creating an emotional ambiguity that Wesley's systematic self-audits failed to resolve. Yet, in a testament to Savannah's strange cosmopolitanism, he also sought out Dr. Samuel Nunes. The Portuguese Jewish physician, who had saved the colony from dysentery 3 years prior, now taught the Anglican minister Spanish, a pragmatic skill for a borderland priest living within striking distance of St. Augustine. The colony was too small to separate these spheres. Wesley's colleague Benjamin Ingham managed to open the Irene School for the Yamacraw, achieving the missionary focus Wesley had lost, while Wesley remained trapped in the town's claustrophobic grid. In colonial Savannah, one's parishioners, romantic interests, language tutors, and political rivals were often the same people, living within shouting distance in a humid, heat-boxed square. The friction was unsustainable. Crimson Rubric, a pastor's peril and poetic legacy. Relationships built on French lessons and pious intentions have a tendency to go sideways, and Wesley's was about to perform a maneuver that would have made a stunt pilot proud. The collapse hinged on a bit of fine print from the Book of Common Prayer concerning communion. "And if any of those be an open and notorious evil liver, the curate shall call him and advertise him, that in any wise he presume not to come to the Lord's table." For Wesley, this wasn't just a suggestion, it was an instruction manual for social implosion. The friction finally sparked on August 7, 1737. Standing at the altar of Christ Church, Wesley refused to serve Holy Communion to the recently married Sophia Hopkey Williamson. His official reason was a failure to give prior notice, a rule he enforced with the cheerful flexibility of a tax auditor. The community, however, diagnosed the situation not as principled church discipline, but as the petty retaliation of a spurned suitor. Wesley proceeded to write letters to Mrs. Williamson in July and August, quoting the exact regulations he was using to humiliate her, a move that rarely rekindles a dying romance. Savannah's reaction was swift. The very next day, a warrant broke the peace of the parsonage. Sophia's new husband, William Williamson, demanded £1,000 in damages. This moved beyond a personal squabble into high-stakes legal theatre, a profound irony in a colony founded explicitly on the prohibition of lawyers. By August 22nd, the case was before a grand jury of 44 men, a group large enough to field 2 baseball teams with umpires to spare. The proceedings shifted from theatre to farce. The chief magistrate presiding over the case was Thomas Causton, who happened to be Sophie's uncle. The conflict of interest was so profound it practically occupied its own chair in the courtroom, and accounts suggest Causton was about as impartial as a hungry wolf judging a sheep-shearing contest. Facing a deck stacked by family loyalty, Wesley wasn't passed a simple verdict, but a laundry list of complaints that put his entire pastoral career on trial in civil court, while a dissenting minority filed a report that essentially amounted to a judicial eye-roll. The majority endorsed 10 charges against him. Convinced that an impartial verdict was about as likely as a blizzard on the Savannah River, Wesley decided his ministry in Georgia had reached its natural conclusion. On the evening of December 2nd, 1737, after evening prayers, he performed his final act in the colony, a hasty exit. He slipped away in a boat bound for South Carolina in what critics called a secret clandestine manner, presumably because announcing your departure is poor form when you are skipping bail. He reached the Charleston area by December 9th and formally took his leave of America on December 22nd aboard the Samuel. He left behind a cloud of public censure and a colony that had rejected his rigidity, yet the disaster was not total. Amidst the wreckage of his personal and professional life, Wesley had compiled and published a collection of psalms and hymns. Printed in Charleston, it is recognized as the first Anglican hymnal ever produced in America. The man who fled the continent under a legal cloud had accidentally seeded a publishing tradition that would eventually energize the very movement he was destined to lead. Aldersgate Flame, Genesis of a Movement. John Wesley slunk back across the Atlantic, washing up on English shores in early 1738 with the distinct air of a man who had fled a small town after a messy breakup. The 2-year Georgia mission, begun with the crisp conviction of an Oxford Don, had ended not with a spiritual harvest, but with a warrant, a jilted lover, and a conveniently timed boat out of town. The New World had thoroughly humbled him, dismantling his rigid confidence somewhere between the Savannah River and the open ocean. This season of brooding reached a quiet climax on the evening of May 24, 1738. Having apparently exhausted London's other diversions, Wesley unwillingly dragged himself to a society meeting on Aldersgate Street. As he sat listening to a reading of Martin Luther's preface to Romans, the internal weather finally broke. He later recorded that he felt his heart was strangely warmed. It was not a thunderclap, but a shift in gravity. He felt he did trust in Christ alone for salvation. Within months, seeking the mechanics of this new engine, he travelled to the Moravian headquarters at Herrnhut in Germany to study under Peter Böhler. By 1739, back in England, Wesley found that his newfound enthusiasm, and perhaps his specific interpretation of it, had alienated the Anglican establishment. Facing a succession of closed church doors, he adopted the radical expedient of taking the show on the road. In Bristol, he began preaching in the open air, becoming the theological equivalent of a busker in the town square. To compel order upon the crowds of converts, he established the New Room in Bristol in June 1739. As the first purpose-built Methodist chapel, it was less a cathedral than a pragmatic multi-tool, schoolroom, clinic, and relief centre. The movement was proving to be as much about logistics as emotion. Later that year, he acquired a disused government cannon factory in London, the Foundry at Moorfields. For a lease of £115 and repairs totalling nearly £800, he repurposed a facility designed to cast weapons of war into a headquarters for mending souls. The branding was on the nose, but the management was distinctive. When his Moravian colleagues began teaching stillness, a passive waiting for faith, Wesley balked. He insisted faith was something exercised into shape. In 1740, he and 50 followers walked out, choosing the spiritual equivalent of a brisk jog over sitting quietly in a cosmic waiting room. Yet just as Wesley began to scale his operation in England, his past came sailing back. The Georgia scandal had been resurrected by Captain Robert Williams, a Bristol merchant and leader of the vocal malcontents. On March 14, 1740, Williams swore an affidavit before the mayor of Bristol, formally accusing Wesley of improper conduct and, more pointedly, asserting that he had deserted his bail in Savannah. The charge was timed to damage Wesley's growing influence, handing ammunition to Anglican critics eager to paint him as dishonourable. Forced into a public relations war, Wesley fired back in 1741 with a meticulously argued 12-page pamphlet. It was a dense, legalistic defence proving that a man can leave the colonies, but the colonies, and their appetite for litigation, never quite leave the man. The irony is difficult to miss while driving down Abercorn Street today, where a city founded on the explicit prohibition of lawyers is now plastered with billboards for personal injury attorneys, exporting legal drama across centuries and oceans. Wesley's divide, faith's ascent, matrimony's descent. The Aldersgate Epiphany in 1738 may have turned the failed Georgia missionary into a spiritual flamethrower, but it apparently came without a user manual for domestic life. For all his methodical discipline and talent for organizing souls into a cohesive enterprise, John Wesley's personal affairs after 1751 resembled a carriage crash in slow motion. The man who could map out a path to salvation for thousands seemed utterly incapable of navigating the territory of a two-person relationship. His chosen partner in this venture was Mary Molly Vazeille, a London widow of Huguenot stock, whom he married in February 1751. On paper, it was a sound merger. She came with a comfortable income of around £300 a year and a portfolio of investments, bringing necessary financial ballast to a movement fueled largely by faith and collection plates. She even pitched in at the Foundry Book Room, suggesting an initial attempt at a shared enterprise. But Wesley's revival schedule, a relentless churn of travel that kept him away from home, collided with any notion of a settled life. Building a nationwide religious movement is rarely conducive to remembering anniversaries. The union frayed almost immediately, devolving from a grand theological drama into a bitter domestic squabble. The final curtain came down in 1771. In his journal, Wesley recorded the definitive end with a line so cold it risks frostbite, written in both Latin and English for clarity. "I did not desert her. I did not send her away. I will not recall her." It possesses the stoic finality of a Roman general condemning a city, not a clergyman discussing his wife. When she died a decade later, news reached him on the road, a postscript to a chapter he had long since closed. Yet, while his marriage collapsed with the sound and fury of a Shakespearean tragedy, the Methodist movement itself was quietly laying the institutional granite of a future empire. Wesley might have been a failed husband, but he was a masterly CEO. He navigated the labyrinth of 18th-century English law with the cunning of a seasoned barrister, securing preaching houses with ironclad trust deeds. This culminated in the 1763 model deed, which ensured that only his authorized preachers could use the pulpits he built. A brilliant defense against Anglican interference and a legal moat around his fledgling kingdom. A key victory followed in 1766, when the King's Bench ruled that magistrates had to license Methodist meeting houses under the old Toleration Act, giving his societies the legal standing they desperately needed. Remarkably, his very public separation from Molly carried no ecclesiastical penalty. In the eyes of the Church of England, separation from bed and board was a private matter, not a canonical offence like adultery that would have forced a bishop's hand. Since Wesley operated largely outside the formal parish system, the church hierarchy had about as much leverage over him as a man trying to lasso a cloud. He was, in effect, judgment-proof. Even as his private life sat in ruins, he was already planning for succession, drafting the 1784 Deed of Declaration to give the Methodist Conference a legal spine that would outlive him. Founding Fathers, a tale of two Wesleys. Did John Wesley, after the protracted drama of his personal life finally subsided with his wife's death, dream of a quiet retirement? One imagines him hoping for a few calm years of tea and reflection, but the 1780s had other plans. Instead of winding down, his final decade became a frantic scramble to solve two problems that threatened to dismantle his legacy: what to do about the Americans, and how to stop his life's work from dissolving the moment he was gone. He was a man in his 80s tasked with building a ship while it was already at sea, and the first leak had just sprung across the Atlantic. The American Revolution was a logistical nightmare for the Church of England, but for Wesley it was a practical crisis. With Anglican authority in the newly independent colonies having collapsed, American Methodists were spiritually stranded. They had preachers to speak, but no priests authorized to serve the sacraments. For a man who prized order, this was an unacceptable state of affairs. In 1784, he broke the glass. He took it upon himself to ordain Thomas Coke and a handful of others, effectively promoting his field managers to executives without consulting the Home Office. He sent them west with a streamlined liturgy titled The Sunday Service of the Methodists in North America. By that December, at a Christmas conference in Baltimore, the Americans had assembled these pieces to form the Methodist Episcopal Church. His brother Charles, ever the high church traditionalist, was horrified. "Ordination," he quipped with the grim satisfaction of a man watching a train wreck, was separation. While this unofficial franchise launched in America, Wesley had to secure the parent company back in Britain. This required the formal execution of the Deed of Declaration on March 9, 1784. One must imagine the scene not as a simple filing of papers, but as a solemn, almost mystical rite. Wesley's representatives entered the Court of Chancery not merely as lawyers, but as high priests of procedure navigating the hallowed halls of English law. The clerks, with their powdered wigs and ink-stained fingers, served as acolytes in this temple of torts, their scratching quills performing the ancient ritual of enrolling a deed. There Wesley legally defined his conference of preachers, the Legal 100, not as a breakaway sect, but as the people called Methodists. It was an act of profound organizational genius, creating a legal spine for his movement that required no political revolution, just a deep understanding of paperwork. His life's work now possessed a legal skeleton and a transatlantic expansion plan. When Wesley died in 1791, he left behind a movement robust enough to function without him. Its resilience came from a peculiar fusion of revivalist energy and an almost pedantic love for rules. The core of this system was the class meeting, a small group that blended spiritual accountability with a penny-a-week fund, a subscription model for communal welfare that paid debts and cared for the poor. The software for this hardware was provided by Charles Wesley. While John gets top billing today, it was Charles who wrote the real hits, composing thousands of hymns that served as a singing catechism. This was an ingenious method for embedding complex doctrine into the minds of the poor and uneducated through tunes that were maddeningly catchy. If you have ever heard "Oh, for a Thousand Tongues to Sing" or belted out "Hark, the herald angels sing" at Christmas, you have Charles Wesley to thank. Though John had insisted on remaining within the Church of England, the momentum was unstoppable. Shortly after his death, the 1795 Plan of Pacification allowed Methodist preachers to administer sacraments in their own chapels, a final snip of the institutional cord. The model was complete. A portable, self-sustaining system of conferences, circuits, and hymn-singing classes that could be, and was, exported across the globe. Altar altered, a republic's sacred shift. Wesley's frantic improvisation left a nagging question. While he was busy constructing a new denomination for America by executive order in 1784, what were the actual Anglicans doing? The Church of England found itself in the unenviable position of being the official faith of the enemy. Its head was the British monarch, its chief administrator was the Bishop of London, and its funding was tied to a government that had just been evicted at gunpoint. It was a church stripped of its privileges, its paycheck, and its long-distance management. Faced with impending irrelevance, the American clergy did what any organization does during a catastrophic identity crisis. They workshopped a new brand. In the years following the war, they reorganized, eventually unveiling the Protestant Episcopal Church in the United States of America in 1789. The name was a masterpiece of committee thinking. Episcopal retained the Greek root for bishop, signaling that the hierarchy remained intact, while Protestant and the dropping of England clarified that the firm was under new local ownership. This new management adopted a suspiciously Republican business model. No longer would a king across the ocean act as supreme governor. Instead, bishops would be elected by a vote of clergy and lay delegates. A radical concession to the times, akin to a medieval fiefdom deciding to poll the serfs on who should be the next lord. It was a delicate balancing act, attempting to maintain apostolic continuity whilst looking patriotically liberated. The church was in an existential crisis, bleeding clergy and lacking legal status, yet it still possessed the majestic liturgy and the better vestments, which provided a certain aesthetic anchor. The most critical task was editing the operating system, the Book of Common Prayer. The American edition, popularized in 1789, was a marvel of efficient revision, retaining the vast majority of the 1662 English text but executing a surgical strike on the politics. All prayers for the King and Parliament were excised. In their place appeared a politically neutral petition for "all in civil authority," a phrase vague enough to cover anyone from George Washington to the local dog catcher. It was the most consequential find and replace operation in ecclesiastical history. Calling oneself Episcopal is an empty boast without actual bishops, however. This presented a logistical hurdle, as English law forbade consecrating a bishop who would not pledge allegiance to the crown. Samuel Seabury, a Connecticut priest, found a workaround. Unable to secure credentials in London, he sailed to Scotland in 1784. There he was consecrated by non-juring bishops, prelates whose own church had long ago broken with the English state over loyalty oaths. It was an ecclesiastical loophole, the equivalent of travelling to a foreign country to renew a driver's license because the local DMV demands a salute to a flag you no longer recognize. With the leadership chart filled, the final problem was solvency. Cut off from tax revenues, parishes transitioned from state-sponsored entities to voluntary associations, learning to pass the collection plate with a newfound, desperate purpose. In Savannah, the shift was remarkably tidy. Christ Church, the colony's first parish, simply carried on. Its vestry adopted the new prayer book, joined the new Diocese of Georgia, and continued operations. It became one of the few parishes in the South with an unbroken lineage stretching from colonial Anglicanism through the Revolution and into the American experiment. The old church had not been destroyed, it had simply adapted, repackaging its spiritual DNA for a market that now required a vote rather than a decree. High Tide Detour, sharks, skulls, and future shorelines. Leaving the theological weight of Wesley's Savannah behind, we drove southeast toward the marshes. Sated by a morning of history and a fish sandwich at the Driftaway Cafe, we pointed the car toward Pin Point. This small community had stuck in my mind since my days on that collegiate traffic survey, primarily because it is the birthplace of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. A visit to the origin point of a man sitting on the nation's highest court felt like a necessary pilgrimage of civic curiosity, and I was eager to see the interpretive center housed in the old A.S. Varn & Sons shellfish factory. Our expedition halted not with a bang, but with a gentle lapping sound. Where the parking lot should have been, a placid, shimmering sheet of water reflected the sky. The tide had not just arrived, it had staged a coup, claiming the asphalt and seeping into the buildings with quiet confidence. A gentleman by the water, who seemed to have made peace with this routine invasion, noted with a shrug that it was an exceptionally high tide, and that the road to Tybee Island was likely underwater as well. As my son raised an eyebrow at the structural integrity of our itinerary, the man offered a prophecy. The water would likely retreat by 2 o'clock. This was no mere flood. It was a king tide, the informal name for a display of cosmic brute force. It occurs during syzygy, when the sun and moon engage in a gravitational tug-of-war with Earth in the middle. This celestial alignment pulls the sea to heights of 9 or 10 feet, turning low-lying roads into temporary canals with casual disdain for human schedules. Defeated by astronomy, we staged a tactical retreat to the nearby University of Georgia Marine Education Center and Aquarium on Skidaway Island. We arrived in time for the animal feedings, a spectacle my son, a budding marine biologist, approached with the focus of a research fellow. He was thrilled to find his favorite fish, the remora, which I have always viewed as the ocean's most committed freeloader. We watched as one plastered itself to a PVC shark with its cephalic suction cup, a marvel of evolutionary design built for the express purpose of getting a free lunch. In the next tank, a shark swam with a disjointed rhythm that suggested it had been assembled from a kit with leftover parts, while we took turns feeding a horseshoe crab, a creature resembling a military helmet abandoned on the beach 450 million years ago. Inside the bone hall, we confronted a collection of skulls that seemed to echo the day's lopsided rhythm. A whale skull in particular caught our eye. It was noticeably asymmetrical, as if nature had sculpted one side and then let an apprentice finish the other. The docent assured us this crookedness was perfectly normal for the species, a comforting thought for anyone whose well-laid plans had just been bent by the tide. Low tide, long shadows, pinpoint, Thomas, and traffic. The Atlantic eventually unclenched its jaw. The king tide, having made its point by swallowing the asphalt, retreated with a sulky gargle, leaving the Lowcountry steamy and accessible once more. We left the lopsided whale skulls and the aquarium behind, retracing our route across the moonscapes of the marsh to resume the morning's thwarted pilgrimage to Pin Point. Years earlier, during a short but distinguished career as a roadside philosopher, a role the University of Georgia formally classified as traffic surveyor, I had spent an afternoon on the shoulder of this same road, dutifully counting cars. It was a simpler geometry then. I tallied a handful of vehicles per hour, and each arrival felt like an event. Now, returning with the solemnity of a historian retracing a lost trail, I found the pavement thick with SUVs headed toward the landings. Crossing the street felt less like a rural stroll and more like frog-hopping an active runway. The world had found this corner of the map. What lodged this place in my memory wasn't the traffic data, but the improbable biographical footnote that this quiet dot of marshland is the birthplace of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. The paradox is delicious. A community rooted in Gullah/Geechee culture, defined by the tidal rhythm and the brutal mechanics of shucking oysters, produced a man who spent a lifetime interpreting the U.S. Constitution. The physical evidence of this origin story survives inside the old A.S. Varn & Sons oyster and crab factory. The complex closed in 1985 after 60 years as the town's economic engine and reopened in 2011 as the Pinpoint Heritage Museum, a project finalized with a financial nudge from Thomas's friend, the developer Harlan Crow. A reminder that historic preservation often relies as much on personal networks as it does on public grants. The interior avoids the sterilizing touch of overcuration. The layout tracks the factory's original workflow, moving from the docks where men unloaded the catch from the Moon River, to the long tables where generations of women separated meat from shell, and finally to the canning lines. There is no need for wistful reenactment here. The building is the primary document. As a placard near the rusted machinery noted, "The tools don't lie." They testify to a life of relentless manual labor where family economies were tethered to tide calendars and a self-reliance forged in the plough mud, an ethic Thomas credits for his judicial worldview. We lingered in the cooling shadows of the factory, absorbing the history of a community settled in 1896 by freed, property-owning African Americans who built a life on the water's edge. The visit concluded with a 35-minute film featuring residents and Thomas himself, their voices reflecting on the traditions embodied by the silent industrial equipment surrounding us. Sweetgrass and salt, Gullah Geechee roots, rights rising. The credits rolled and the screen faded, leaving me in the quiet gloom of the converted factory. The film had traced the improbable arc of a Supreme Court justice rising from this tidal hamlet, yet the explanation clearly extended beyond the borders of Pin Point. It stretched 400 miles south and 4,000 miles east. In 2006, Congress attempted to acknowledge this scope by designating the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. The name suggests a static, well-lit hallway in a federal building, but the reality is a sprawling living domain threading through the coastal lowcountry of 4 states. Locals, possessing a practicality that outlasts government plaques, rely on a simpler geography. In South Carolina, the culture is Gullah. Cross the Savannah River into Georgia, and the dialect shifts to Geechee. The distinction is as nuanced and non-negotiable as the boundary between salt water and fresh. Both terms describe the descendants of West Africans kidnapped for a specific expertise. They were masters of the water. Planters did not view these captives merely as labor, but as imported technology. Their knowledge of cultivating rice in the tidal flats of the Rice Coast, Sierra Leone and Liberia made them essential for the brutal hydraulic engineering required on Georgia plantations. In the 1930s, the linguist Lorenzo Dow Turner dismantled the assumption that their speech was broken English, revealing it instead as a Creole structure retaining syntax and vocabulary from Mende, Vai, and Wolof. That this culture survived the crusher of chattel slavery is a result of isolation, ecology, and unintentional quarantine. The barrier islands served as natural fortresses, while the swampy interior bred malaria. Europeans, lacking genetic resistance, died in droves or fled to inland summer homes, leaving the day-to-day operations and a degree of autonomy to the enslaved population. The mosquito became the unlikely guardian of a civilization, preserving African folkways, the ring shout, and a cuisine dependent on the estuary's rhythm. Wandering back through the canning room, I realized Pin Point is a relatively modern chapter in this saga. The community was founded in 1896 by families fleeing the hurricane-ravaged cabins of Ossabaw Island. On Ossabaw, the tabby ruins of older quarters still crumble into the soil. Further south on Sapelo Island, the community of Hog Hammock fights to hold its ground against tax assessments and encroaching development, a modern iteration of a centuries-old struggle for permanence. The diaspora even jumps the map entirely. After the American Revolution, British loyalists fleeing Savannah trafficked enslaved Gullah and Geechee people to the Turks and Caicos, forcing them into the cotton fields and salt pans of the Caribbean. It is a heritage woven from resilience and water, maintained by those who learned to read the sky and the sea. My own movements that day felt trivial by comparison, yet they were governed by the same mechanics. The tides had dictated the schedule of the crab pickers in this room a century ago, just as they had flooded the road and redirected my afternoon. I walked back out to the car, a former traffic surveyor tracing a route through a world that still moves at the pleasure of the moon. Johnny Mercer, the native son and songwriter. Leaving the interpretive center, the weight of 4 centuries of Gullah/Geechee endurance left us craving something simpler. Sand and water seemed like the appropriate antidote, so my wife and I launched an optimistic expedition toward the beach. The Atlantic, however, had other plans. The day had turned cold, the sky a uniform shade of lead, and a damp, resentful wind whipped off the ocean, thwarting any hope of a walk. We briefly considered a tactical retreat to downtown Savannah, but it was a Friday. The city would be in the grip of the weekly migration of SCAD students from art studios to public houses, a force of nature best observed from a safe distance. Defeated in our destination but still in motion, we drifted. Our route took us past the Landings, a sprawling community where my wife noted many of her physician colleagues resided. The sight of the entrance brought back a sharp memory from my days as a traffic surveyor, a job that was 1 part civil engineering and 9 parts being told where to go. Years ago, I had approached the gates of this very fortress of domesticity, clipboard in hand, only to be rejected by a guard with the quiet, unappealable authority of a man defending the last bastion of lawn care standards. It was a firm reminder that on the coast, some geography is more private than others. That friction between gated exclusion and public memory brought to mind another local figure, one who managed to redraw the map entirely. Of all the men to come from Savannah, few have altered the actual cartography more than John Herndon, Johnny Mercer. A fourth-generation son of the city, Mercer grew up on East Gwinnett Street, absorbing the sounds that drifted up to his balcony, the call and response chants of stevedores and the rhythms of black church choirs, a musical DNA that later surfaced in his work. He became a high priest of the American popular song, writing lyrics for over 1,500 tunes, co-founding Capitol Records with stunning entrepreneurial foresight and collecting a frankly greedy 4 Academy Awards along the way. Yet it was a song written an ocean away from Savannah for the 1961 film Breakfast at Tiffany's that performed an act of reverse alchemy, turning Hollywood gold back into hometown soil. Mercer later confessed that the lyrics for Moon River, set to Henry Mancini's melody, were drawn directly from his childhood memories of the waterway flowing past the south side of the city, near his haunts on Skidaway and Burnside Islands. The lines feel less written than remembered, a pure distillation of place. That huckleberry friend was his shorthand for the companions of his youth, a symbol of shared innocent adventures on the marsh. The song's success was so total that the Chatham County government decided the most logical response was a bit of light cartographical housekeeping. In 1962, by an official act of the Georgia legislature, the waterway Mercer remembered, until then prosaically named the Back River, was officially renamed Moon River. It remains a rare instance of a hit single achieving a level of geopolitical influence normally reserved for a border treaty. Today, a historical marker near the Skidaway River overlook confirms the story, and the lyrics feel less like nostalgia than a map set to music. It is a geography we had just walked through. The Pinpoint Heritage Museum sits right on the edge of the Moon River marsh. Surrender's shelter, pines, streetcars, and dreams deferred. The damp chill of the previous day and the exclusionary gates of the landings had left a lingering impression. My brain, rebuffed by both the weather and the guard posts of modern suburbia, looked for a different sort of puzzle to dismantle. I found myself fixated on Savannah's awkward middle years, the half-century following the Civil War. It is a period often glossed over in favor of colonial squares or garden-variety ghost stories, yet it poses a specific problem of civic survival. What does a city do after it has been given away as a Christmas present? The story resets with that surrender. In December 1864, General Sherman offered Savannah and its 25,000 bales of cotton to President Lincoln as a Christmas gift. The gesture spared the city the torch but left its economy in ruins. The tidal rice industry, the engine of antebellum wealth, collapsed almost overnight. Without the forced labor of enslaved people to maintain the complex hydraulic system of dikes, trunks, and canals, the entire enterprise surrendered to the marsh. Output fell from a staggering £51 million in 1859 to a statistical rounding error by 1919. A decline hastened by hurricanes that treated the neglected waterworks as brittle suggestions rather than barriers. Into this vacuum flowed a new commercial monarch, stickier and less aristocratic than the last: naval stores. By the 1890s, the rosin and turpentine bled from the region's endless pine forests became the city's lifeblood. It was a gritty trade that tied the coast to global shipping with the sharp, medicinal scent of pine rather than the soft fiber of cotton. Not that cotton had vanished. The Savannah Cotton Exchange, completed in 1887, asserted the crop's lingering dominance with structural bravado. The trading hall was built directly over a public street, allowing the brokers to work above the traffic while the draymen rumbled below. A literal stratification of commerce that squeezed every available inch from the bluff. The federal administration of the immediate post-war years brought complexities that brick and mortar could not obscure. In a parlor at the Green Meldrum House, Sherman and Secretary of War Edwin Stanton met with 20 black ministers to discuss the future of the newly freed population. This conversation produced Special Field Orders No. 15, the famous promise of land redistribution across the Sea Islands. The policy was announced to a packed congregation at Second African Baptist Church, offering a vision of autonomy rooted in 40-acre plots. Then, with the unique bureaucratic whiplash of the era, President Andrew Johnson rescinded the order, reclaiming the future before the ink had fully dried. Progress, denied one avenue, forced its way through others. The Beach Institute opened in 1867 as the city's first purpose-built school for African Americans, creating a brick-and-mortar foothold for education. Leaders like Ulysses L. Houston transitioned from the pulpit to the legislature, proving that the skills required to hold a congregation's attention translated seamlessly to the State House. Private wealth from the pre-war era also began to launder itself into civic benevolence. Mary Telfair, heir to a fortune older than the conflict, funded landmarks that redefined the city's cultural landscape in 1886. Her family mansion became the Telfair Academy, the first public art museum in the United States founded by a woman, while the nearby Telfair Hospital for Females established itself as the state's first hospital dedicated to women's care. It was a quiet, distinctive modernization funded by the dividends of the past. The city physically expanded to match this new institutional weight. A streetcar system launched in 1869 pushed boundaries southward, creating the Victorian District, a suburb that signaled Savannah was no longer confined to Oglethorpe's grid. This spirit of endurance proved useful when fire gutted the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in 1898. That Mass was held in the rebuilt structure just 1 year later was a feat of fundraising disguised as a miracle. The Independent Presbyterian Church pulled off a similar resurrection after its own 1889 fire, and the Congregation of Mikveh Israel signaled its permanence with a Gothic Revival synagogue on Monterey Square in 1878. But the most enduring act of this era was one of landscape curation. In the 1890s, a descendant of Noble Jones planted the mile-and-a-half avenue of live oaks at Wormsloe. The image that now defines colonial Georgia for millions of visitors, the moss-draped tunnel framing the ruins, is in fact a late Victorian flourish. It was a Gilded Age filter applied to a colonial property, a confident aesthetic edit that ensured the past would look exactly how the present imagined it should. Cotton to cellulose, runways, battlements, and beach roads. If the Oak Avenue at Wormsloe was a polite fiction, the air hanging over the port offered a more honest reality. As the Gilded Age faded, the city's signature scent shifted from the earthen musk of cotton to something sharper, stickier, and decidedly less poetic. Naval stores. The solvent tang of turpentine and pine rosin became the new perfume of commerce, marking Savannah as a global dispensary for the substances that kept wooden ships from rotting. It was a gritty trade. Industrial caulking has little romance, but it kept the docks from gathering dust when the cotton market faltered. This pragmatic shift found its ultimate expression in 1935, when the Union Bag and Paper Company decided the riverfront needed an architectural statement the size of a medieval fortress. The resulting mill was a creature of pure function, an industrial behemoth that offered thousands of steady jobs through the Depression's leanest years. Dropped unceremoniously into the marshy elegance of the Lowcountry, the complex proved that a reliable paycheck was just as attractive as a moss-draped oak, and perhaps more essential for survival. Nowhere was this lurch into modernity more dramatic than in how people reached the ocean. For decades, the Savannah and Atlantic Railroad had dutifully shuttled passengers to Tybee Island on a rigid schedule. Then, in 1923, the city paved Tybee Road, unleashing the great executioner of timetables, the personal automobile. The freedom to drive to the shore on a whim made the train seem as obsolete as a steam-powered monocle. By 1933, gas stations and the freewheeling spirit of the day trip had siphoned off the rail line's revenue, killing the service. The Tybrisa Pavilion rose to entertain the new crowds arriving on 4 wheels, a monument to the triumph of impulse over itinerary. As Savannah paved its way to the beach, it also split its focus between the clouds and the crypts. The city opened a municipal airport in 1929, a bold gesture toward the theoretical age of aviation while simultaneously campaigning to rescue Fort Pulaski from decay. President Coolidge declared the brick fortress a national monument in 1924, enshrining the past even as the tarmac welcomed the future. A curious dual impulse, like a man learning to fly while insuring his antiques. This era of reinvention also produced an institution of global consequence, sparked by one of the city's own. In 1912, Juliette Gordon Low, having observed the Boy Scout movement, responded to the girls who had been politely excluded from the ranks. In her Bull Street carriage house, she gathered 18 local girls and founded a sorority of survivalists that would become the Girl Scouts. It was a quiet coup, proving that if you aren't invited to the party, the most effective response is to build a superior clubhouse next door. While Low organized for social resilience, the military organized for war. The Victorian impulse to plant decorative avenues like the one at Wormsloe gave way to the grim business of coastal defense. Fort Screven stood guard on Tybee Island, a sentinel protecting the river's mouth with a purpose sharpened by a world sliding toward conflict. I followed this thread of preparedness to its quiet conclusion. From 1932 to 1933, the post commander at Fort Screven was George C. Marshall. The future architect of Allied victory spent his days here overseeing infrastructure that served as the final marker of this transition. My mental tour through the city's adolescence had moved from the scent of pine tar to the roar of beach traffic, ending at the silent coastal batteries. Concrete husks left behind by a city that had finally grown up, just in time to face the 20th century's greatest test. Savannah's pillars, port, progress, and poetic past. The tidy, almost quaint economic diversification of pre-war Savannah, with its paper mills and fledgling airport, was merely the overture. The real performance, I was discovering, was the post-war Symphony of Commerce, a 4-movement piece played with the subtlety of a brass band falling down a flight of stairs. Modern Savannah's prosperity involves a shimmering mirage of mint juleps and moss-draped serenity that relies on 4 colossal, deep-set and undeniably unserene industrial legs. It is a city that has mastered the art of paying for its preservation by embracing the very engines of modernity it seems to stand against. The loudest instrument is the titan of trade, the Port of Savannah. This is the city's true headliner, an economic engine so vast it makes the old cotton trade look like a hobbyist's weekend project. Every year, a flotilla of steel behemoths deposits nearly 5.6 million 20-foot containers, a quantity of boxed goods that, if stacked, would give pause to even the most ambitious pyramid-building pharaoh. To get this mountain of stuff off the coast, the port authorities built the Mason Mega Rail Facility, a name that sounds less like a train yard and more like a villain's lair from a vintage action movie. From here, cargo shoots into the nation's interior and reaches the Midwest in a blur of velocity that would have seemed like witchcraft to the old riverboat captains. Even the infrastructure has a history of trial and error. The Sydney Lanier Bridge near Brunswick, a graceful sweep of cable and steel, had to replace an older lift bridge that ocean-going ships kept hitting with the determined accuracy of a boxer working a heavy bag. While the port moves the boxes, other engines move the people. Savannah has become a hub for high-skill manufacturing, specifically the kind with wings and wheels, and Gulfstream has its global headquarters here on a pristine campus dedicated to the art of luxurious flight. Just down the road, in a democratic counterpoint, the Hyundai Motor Group Metaplant America churns out electric vehicles for the rest of us. This sprawling EV factory is a small city of automation and ambition, attended by its own linked battery complex, aiming to build 300,000 cars a year. It is a curious portfolio that builds elite aircraft for those who wish to soar above it all, and electric cars for those trying to navigate the traffic down below. The third pillar is the one you rarely see from a tour bus. The steady and thunderous beat of defense spending. Fort Stewart and Hunter Army Airfield pump nearly $6 billion a year into the region, a quiet subsidy that keeps the whole enterprise humming. Even the atomic age left its mark. The Savannah River site, a Cold War relic across the border in South Carolina, was built in 1950 to produce plutonium and tritium. It has since pivoted to the necessary job of environmental cleanup, yet in a move of spectacular irony, part of that site is being repurposed into the Savannah River Plutonium Processing Facility to manufacture new plutonium pits for the nation's arsenal. It represents a masterclass in recycling that turns yesteryear's apocalyptic infrastructure into tomorrow's. All that industry and defense spending provides the foundation for the city's most famous asset, its own past. Tourism is a nearly $5 billion enterprise that runs on the fumes of history. We have this industry largely thanks to General Sherman, who in 1864 decided to spare the city and offer it, along with 25,000 bales of cotton, as a Christmas gift to Abraham Lincoln. This act of strategic clemency preserved the architecture that now draws millions of visitors and proved that sometimes the most profitable business decision is simply not burning something to the ground. This preserved landscape became the perfect campus for the Savannah College of Art and Design, or SCAD, which acts less like a school and more like a cultural and economic vortex. With an annual impact of $1 billion, SCAD has perfected the art of adaptive reuse by turning old warehouses like the former Central of Georgia Railway Depot into gleaming museums and classrooms. It preserves the city's skin while it injects a new and vastly more profitable soul. Between the film festivals, movie productions, and university events, the creative economy has become the photogenic face of a machine built on containers, fighter jets, and atoms. Gazing at it all, from the resurrected oyster factories at Pinpoint to the marine sanctuary offshore, it is clear that everything here, from history to nature itself, has been appraised, polished, and put to work. Savannah's strains, fates, and fortunes fissure. Underneath the Savannah that has been appraised, polished, and put to work lies a much grittier personal geology. It is a city my wife and I once inhabited simultaneously, a fact of shared geography that carries the historical weight of two ships passing in the night, provided one ship had already sailed and the other was just arriving from Greenville, South Carolina. We occasionally revisit this cosmic near-miss, speculating on the alternate timeline that might have unfolded had we met 5 years earlier. It remains a fascinating potential history. A paradox that we debate with the gravity of Napoleon wondering about the weather at Waterloo. While she was living the romantic moss-draped version of the city, my own experience was less picturesque. My career path at the time resembled the frantic scramble of a squirrel who had forgotten where he buried his nuts. To pay the rent, I explored Savannah's stranger corners, choosing random points on a map and driving there in a search for gainful employment. My first landing was at a Bombay Company store in the Oglethorpe Mall, a retail purgatory. I held briefly before securing a gig in temporary traffic control. This new venture felt like a fiscal mirage. The pay was a staggering $100 a day, but the work itself was a municipal unicorn, a creature spoken of in hushed tones but rarely seen. I spent my time driving around the Lowcountry rather than Atlanta, viewing the industrial guts of the city that tourists pay good money to avoid. This itinerant lifestyle eventually led me, with profound irony, to a medical laboratory. There, a man with a master's degree in graphic design became a fixer of problems of a distinctly non-graphical nature. That final plot twist landed me a job in Atlanta and a ticket out. My eagerness to depart Savannah had by then achieved the status of spiritual conviction. The official culmination of my residency was my graduation, an event I celebrated by refusing to participate. There was no walk, no ceremony, no tossing of a tasseled hat. My entire academic quest boiled down to a tense portfolio review where, to be frank, the outcome was uncertain. I could feel the deliberation in the other room, a discussion with the solemnity of a papal conclave deciding whether to grant sainthood to a particularly troublesome applicant. The fact that they passed me felt less like an endorsement and more like a weary decision to unleash me upon the world. In some small way, I suppose my subsequent career has vindicated their dubious judgment. To honor this victory, I engaged in a truly ruinous splurge, a $5 hamburger from Checkers. In the context of my life, this was a feast of Lucullan decadence. I had been surviving via a game where I tried to eat for less than $1 a day. A series of budgetary gymnastics made possible only by a reliable dorm-issue George Foreman grill. To spend 5 times my daily budget on a single meal felt like an act of glorious, unrestrained rebellion. With my degree secured and a stomach full of celebratory beef, I was ready to execute my grand exit. I returned to my apartment one last time to pick up an expensive printer, only to be met by a solemn delegation of staff. They stood in my living room and informed me that a pinhole leak had developed in the toilet's water feed line. It had been dripping into the unit below, a final petty act of sabotage from a city I was already fleeing. I felt a pang of genuine sympathy for my downstairs neighbor, but the fault lay with the regrettable state of the plumbing, a problem matched only by an air conditioning unit wholly unequal to the task of fighting a Savannah summer. That's a wrap on Chapter 3 of The Rise the Limit. There's something fitting about a day governed by king tides, where the water decides what you can and can't reach, because Savannah itself has always been a place where currents, human and otherwise, deposit layers of meaning and then retreat before you've fully taken stock. It turns out the best way to revisit a place you once passed through is to let the flood schedule rewrite your itinerary. If you enjoyed this journey, the complete travelogue is available right now as a Kindle book on Amazon, Palmetto Bugs and Broken Arrows, and if you want to come behind the scenes and get bonus content, you can join my community on Patreon. This was the final chapter of the series, so thank you for walking every oak-lined mile and flooded detour with me. The tides are out, and the road is yours.